Welcome to the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show with Corey and Justin. Here they are, the Fourth and Long Fantasy Brothers.
Welcome in to the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. My name is Corey, and I am here with my actual brother, Justin.
Hello, this is Justin.
Justin, today we're talking all about busts, but before we do, is there anything you want to talk about before we get into it?
Corey, we're in the midst of training camp here. I've got some quick hits I want to hit you with here, get your rapid reaction here. So the first one I've got, Broncos beat writer believes Javonte Williams will be the Broncos week 1 starter. He says you don't trade up for a running back to not give him big work right away. What's your reaction there, Corey?
Justin, that's noise to me. What do you think?
Well, I agree. You're going to get all those pump-up stories this time of year, right? So I'm going to take it with a grain of salt. Let's see what happens in training camp. Let's see what happens in preseason, then I'll make my assessment.
Yep.
Corey, Tyrell Williams appears to be Detroit quarterback Jared Goff's number 1 receiver. Is there any value there in the Detroit wide receiver room this year?
Well, this is news that I kind of like to hear because this is a situation I don't understand. There's value. I mean, any wide receiver room is going to pose wide receiver 3s or wide receiver 4s, even in the worst possible offense. So, more and more leagues out there have more and more and are starting more and more wide receivers. So with that being the case, there's going to be value with somebody here, and maybe it's Tyrell Williams.
Could see the rookie Amon St. Brown potentially emerge down the stretch, but I think Tyrell Williams could be a rock-solid wide receiver 3, at least at the beginning of the season. Corey, then we've got Evan Ingram, New York Giants tight end. Quote-unquote, was the best offensive player on the field this spring, looking quicker than ever, catching everything thrown in his direction after a season filled with drop passes. Corey, are you and I too low on Evan Ingram this year?
Justin, this is noise again to me. I've learned to not trust Evan Ingram, and no beat reporter is going to tell me otherwise.
It's been a downward spiral ever since that rookie year for Evan Ingram. Just can't seem to hold on to the ball. I'm passing Evan Ingram this year. And then we've got another tight end, Corey, rookie. Lots of hype building around this guy, Kyle Pitts. The Falcons are reportedly force-feeding Kyle Pitts in practice. Corey, are we ready to jump on the bandwagon here and crown Kyle Pitts the best rookie tight end ever?
Justin, he's my tight end 4. I don't know how much more I can crown him in his rookie year. This is definitely a situation where the hype can get out of control, and this is the start of it.
Yeah, totally agree. Kyle Pitts will be an interesting name to monitor as we approach draft season. I think he'll be one of those rookie favorites here from the tight end position. Looking forward to seeing how he does.
All right, Justin. Well, another week and another time for us to talk about our fantasy football busts. We are talking about the guys that we don't think will bring back the value that the consensus seems to think that they will. So with that said, Justin, let's get to it.
On today's show,
we're talking busts, and Justin and I are going to each bring up 4 guys based on where they're currently falling in the consensus who we do think will not return the value that the rest of the fantasy community seems to think they will. I always like to say that you can catch value by zigging when everyone else is zagging, and that's what we're going to do here today. So, Justin, with that said, we each have 4 guys. We're going to go in kind of a random order, but also maybe try to save the big names for later. Let's get things started, Justin, with your first bust. Who do you want to talk about?
I'm going to get things started here with Washington football team tight ends Logan Thomas. Now Thomas was a high volume fixture on this offense last year, and I was actually surprised to see, Corey, that Thomas finished the season first in route runs with 610 routes last year, and he was actually third in tight end targets last year with 105. That helped vault him into that tight end 4 position, which is really impressive for a guy that was really off the radar before the season started. I think if you took a gamble on Thomas, you were relatively happy with what he did. I mean, a top 5 tight end that you got for free off the waiver wire is always a great investment. Now, outside of J.D. McKissic, right, the scat running back, pass-catching running back they have on that team, Thomas definitely benefited a lot from Alex Smith and his dink and dunk offense, right, those short area targets close to the line of scrimmage. And that was really Thomas's bread and butter last season in this offense. Now, you look at this season, right? Enter Curtis Samuel, enter Adam Humphries, and then enter Ryan Fitzpatrick as well, the new quarterback here for the Washington football team. And I think as a result of all of those additions, we're going to see a little less volume. I don't see Thomas in that 105 target range this year in 2021. Now, in addition to that, Corey, an interesting stat that I've read as well was that when you look at Logan Thomas's game log production throughout the year, when Antonio Gibson, the second-year running back, was on the field, his production fell off pretty significantly. He went from averaging right around 80 yards a game when Gibson was off the field to only 30 yards a game when Gibson was actually playing and on the field and an active part of that offense. That's an interesting stat. Now, Thomas is ranked right now as a top 10 tight end. I think he's right around that tight end 7, 8 range, right after you get past those guys like, TJ Hockenson, Mark Andrews, Dallas Goedert, et cetera. I think he'll contribute here and there, but I don't see him finishing in the top 15 in 2021. And I think those fantasy managers that are drafting him as a top 10 or even top 8 tight end are going to be a bit disappointed.
Yeah, Justin, this seems like a pretty good call, and one that I definitely can agree with here. Logan Thomas is no one who really excited me last year, and I don't think he's in a situation this year that makes me excited. A lot of people might say it's worth getting jazzed up about because Ryan Fitzpatrick is there, but it's going to be a different looking offense, as you stated. I think he's someone that's worth looking away from this year. He's definitely a risky player. I would say he's going to fall more in line with that Eric Ebron, Gary Barnidge type of player where they're good for that 1 year. And if you had them for that 1 year, good for you. Otherwise, it's probably just best to stay away.
Yeah, I like guys like Tyler Higbee and Jonnu Smith above Logan Thomas this year, who are ranked right now below Thomas. But yeah, I think it's a call that I think might come to fruition here. We'll see. Corey, who do you got as your first bust here on this list?
Sure. Well, I'm going to go with a situation where, once again, I'm zigging where the consensus is zagging. And I'm going to call out the fantasy community here by not being consistent, because here's the situation. When the Eagles drafted Devontae Smith, you saw every Eagles wide receiver tank in terms of expert consensus rankings. You saw the same thing happen with James Robinson. You saw the same thing happen with Melvin Gordon. You saw it happen with a lot of first-round skill position players who seem to have got supplanted by rookies. Now, arguably, the most talented player who was drafted was Jamar Chase going to the Cincinnati Bengals. And yet, when I looked, Justin, T. Higgins is still wide receiver 26. That's a borderline wide receiver, too, for a guy who I feel may quickly become the third most reliable option on his own offense. And as far as we know, it's not an offense that's going to blow our socks off. Maybe it will be, but in my mind, T. Higgins as the wide receiver 26 is a really, really bad call. I think his fantasy stock should have really taken a hit. Not necessarily because I don't think he has some talent in him, but if people are thinking that he's going to be a valuable third option, I'd like to point you to a much better and potent fantasy offense like the Dallas Cowboys and tell me how those Michael Gallup shares have been treating you lately. T. Higgins is about to become the next Michael Gallup, and he's not going to be fun to own. Right now, if you're drafting him as a high-end wide receiver 3 or even a low-end wide receiver 2, you are making a mistake, Justin. That's my opinion.
Jamar Chase's presence alone, I think, definitely drops T. Higgins' potential to continue to sustain that success he saw in his rookie season. I think, I do think that all three of these Bengals wide receivers, right, Chase, Higgins, and Boyd, will be productive this year, right? We've seen offenses sustain multiple top 30 wide receivers. We could see that again, especially given the fact that the Bengals defense has not really gotten much better. We could see Joe Burrow and the Bengals offense in a lot of shootouts. But I agree, Corey. I've got Higgins as my lowest Bengal wide receiver ranked this year, and I think it's a good call. I think people that are hoping that he'll take that next step in the 2021 season are going to be a bit disappointed.
Yeah, that's my thought on it, Justin. And I really think he's someone that, people are going to be drafting as a starter, and that is a risky and bad call. Now, Justin, who's your number 3 bust? Why don't you move on with that?
So my second guy, number 3 on this list, is going to be Houston Texans running back David Johnson. Now, as I thought about making a bust list, Corey, David Johnson was at the forefront of my mind. Really, he was the first guy I thought of. And it's been a while since we've seen elite David Johnson, right? 2016, 5 years ago. It's crazy to think that it was that long ago that he put up that 2,000-yard, 20-plus touchdown season. Now, I will say this, right? David Johnson was surprisingly consistent last year. I was looking it up. He was actually the RB16 in terms of fantasy points per game at the position. And he actually really came on as a David Johnson owner last year. He came on really well at the end of the season. The last 3 games of the year, he was actually a top 5 running back in points per game. He really performed well down the stretch for you. If you had him and you were in the playoffs, you were pretty happy. But David Johnson's now 29 years old. He's on the wrong side of his career. And the situation in Houston is really ugly, Corey. It really is. First off, you look at the injury concerns with DJ. They continue to pop up year in and year out. He missed a couple games last year with what I think was a concussion issue. And it seems like a recurring theme. I feel like, I own DJ in a keeper league for the last couple of years. And I feel like every year it's like he misses a handful of games. And it's frustrating to own a guy like that who you can't count on week in and week out. Understanding that, everyone gets hurt, right? It's incredibly random. But with David Johnson, it just seems like every year he's missing a handful of games. Now, in addition to injuries, you've got the elephant in the room, the Deshaun Watson situation, right? We don't know if Deshaun Watson is going to be the quarterback for the Houston Texans this year. We don't know if he's going to be even a quarterback in the NFL this year. He could be on the commissioner's exempt list come week 1. It's a difficult situation to project here because if you take Deshaun Watson out of that Houston Texans offense, it decreases the floor of everyone, right? The passing game, the running game, it really hurts everything when you take your best player off the field. That's concerning to me. Now, on top of that, I'm going to keep going here, right? It's a crowded running back room as well. You look at last year, David Johnson was the main guy, right? He was the RB1 in that offense. He had an RB1 sort of snap share where he was playing pretty consistently on a lot of downs. I mean, it was not frustrating to watch David Johnson out there on first, second, and third down getting, a lot of the snaps in that Houston backfield. Now you've got Phillip Lindsay coming in. You've got Mark Ingram coming in. You've got Rex Burkhead, who just was recently signed a few weeks ago. It's pretty ugly, man. Now, right, that 50% snap share that I think he's probably going to see, right? He's going to be that first running back out in the field with the Houston backfield. He's going to be that first running back to see the field, but he's probably only going to be in a 50% snap share sort of role. And that'd be great in an offense like Baltimore or, Kansas City or the Chargers, but in Houston, I don't know that 50% snap share is necessarily worth all that much. And, on top of that, like I said earlier, Houston offense and the Houston situation looks pretty dire this year. I think they have the lowest win total right now from Vegas and their odds. And it just looks like they're going to be one of the worst teams in the league. And I don't really want to invest in a crowded running back room and for one of the worst teams in the league. Now, I will say this, his ADP is not terrible right now. I think he's being valued in that sort of RB 25 to 30 range right now.
Well, Justin, let me take over just for a second, because that's the elephant in the room that I want to ask you. David Johnson right now, expert consensus half PPR, RB 33. So am I wrong in challenging you on saying that the price is not all that steep when he's going around guys like Javonte Williams and Damian Harris and Zach Moss as running backs?
Sure. No, I totally get it, right? I mean, his ADP is not terrible right now, especially for a guy that came on late at the end of the year and was probably won you a championship if you had him on your squad. But I don't know if he's even going to get there, to be honest with you. I don't think the headache of owning a guy like David Johnson, where he's going to probably miss a handful of games, there's going to be those games where he really does well, and then there's going to be those games where it's going to be a Phillip Lindsay game or a Mark Ingram game or a Rex Burkhead game where Rex is going to, plow in two touchdowns at the goal line. And I don't know necessarily that the ride's going to be totally worth it, Corey. I'm staying away. No thanks for me.
All right, Justin. Well, I'm going to disagree with that one just because I think the price is baked into it this year with David Johnson, unlike in years previous. But I appreciate the take. Now, let's move on to my second guy, my number 3 in the list. And that's going to be a guy that I think is probably going to be a controversial take, and that's TJ Hockenson. Now, I am not going to argue that TJ Hockenson should not be the 4th tight end off the board, because I think that that's a reasonable thing. Maybe he might be 5th or 6th for me when it comes to draft time. What I am going to argue about here is not that he's the tight end 4, but if you actually look sort of overall at expert consensus rankings, and I understand that may not be necessarily where guys end up going in drafts, but he currently, expert consensus, is at 52, Justin. 52. That means in a 12-team league, you are taking TJ Hockenson in the 4th round of your draft. That is a steep price to pay for a tight end who's just assumed to take over a workload in an offense that we know nothing about because it's a brand new coaching staff. This seems like a risky move. I like the player. I think you know that, Justin. I was a big fan of him coming out of college. I even had him on some teams when he came out of college, some fantasy teams when he came out of college. And I'm so happy to see him, gaining the respect that I think he does deserve. But 52 in a draft, oh man, I am staying away and far away, Justin.
Corey, I was just looking. The Lions have 216 vacated targets from last season. That's pretty incredible to look at guys like Kenny Golladay, Marvin Jones, Danny Amendola, who have all left that offense. Obviously enter Tyrell Williams, Brashad Perriman, Amon St. Brown, but I don't really see Williams and Perryman potentially lasting the whole season, potentially. St. Brown is a rookie. So, I get the call, right? I think it is a steep price to pay for a position that, doesn't always return the best in relation to other players that are being drafted around him. But TJ Hawkinson's situation is set up in a position right now where he could be 125 to 140 target tight end. And if I can get a piece of that, man, and potentially get the next big breakout tight end star, I might take it. I get the call. But at the same time, I think the tight end position is such a barren landscape that I might take the plunge on TJ Hockenson this year.
Sure, Justin, I can agree to that, and I can understand that. But 52, fourth round, and all you're really doing is looking at depth chart, right? I mean, that's all you're really doing.
It's expensive. Yeah, there's no denying that. I mean, the Lions are I think, the second or third lowest win total team this year. So I think they're going to be a bit of a dumpster fire as well. But, even bad teams produce decent fantasy starters here and there. So TJ Hockenson could be one of the main beneficiaries, but I don't hate the call.
Okay. All right. Well, all right, Justin. Well, with that said, why don't we move on? Your third guy, number 2 on the list. Who is your next bust?
So my next bust here is going to be Philadelphia Eagles running back Myles Sanders. This might be a controversial take for some of those Myles Sanders Eagles truthers out there. And, there remains that sort of glimmer of hope, right, that Sanders becomes the running back that most people thought he would become right after he was drafted a couple years ago. And he's shown, right, that he can really produce well when he's given some opportunity. And he tends to contribute pretty well when he is given that opportunity. But the issue here, Corey, is that exact word, right? That exact word that I just mentioned, which is opportunity. And the last few years under Doug Peterson in that Eagles offense, he's been that 12 to 15 touch back. And, he occasionally will get those 20 plus touch games. And, it happens here or there, but it doesn't really happen enough. And now you've got Nick Sirianni coming in, right? Peterson's out, Sirianni's in, new head coach for the Eagles. And I don't think we see Sirianni go with a bell cow backfield situation. And that running back room, very similar to David Johnson that I talked about earlier, is really, really crowded. They've brought back Jordan Howard, right? They claimed one of my old loves in Kerryon Johnson. They drafted Kenneth Gainwell in the draft, and they still have Boston Scott, that little, the Boston Scott in their backfield. It's crowded. Now, will Sanders be productive this year? Sure. I think he probably will be. I think he'll be a productive running back here and there, but he's currently ranked right next to guys like CEH, and he's actually ranked ahead of some guys like Chris Carson and David Montgomery and Kareem Hunt and, even Mike Davis. And I tend to like all of those running backs above Myles Sanders this year. Now, again, I think Sanders is a good player. I think he'll be a contributor, right, for your fantasy squad this year. But they've added a bit too much to that running back room. It's a bit too crowded. It's really tight in there. I don't know that I'd feel necessarily all that good, Corey, about taking Myles Sanders as my RB2. It could be a frustrating ride for those fantasy managers who are, really relying on Myles Sanders for this coming season.
Justin, talking about not so great rides, I'm going to segue this right into my second guy on the list. Well, third guy in total, but second as we count our way down. And that's another guy who's being drafted as an RB2, and that's Myles Gaskin. And the reason why I want to segue here is because a lot of the points you made with Sanders, I'm going to make with Gaskin here. This is looking at a depth chart and saying, well, this is the guy who's up on top. And, at this point, I could use a running back. And he had a sample size of a few games at the end of the year where I could say, oh, wow, this might be an exciting RB2. But I warn you folks, don't do that. Don't run away with Myles Gaskin here, because this was a situation that we were fully expecting Miami to find an alternative route. And now all of a sudden that there isn't an alternative route, now we all are just loving Myles Gaskin with our eyes closed. I'm not going to do it, Justin. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, look, there are other opportunities on this roster, just like within the Eagles situation. There's a couple backups on that roster that might be able to overtake him if they are, as I believe, players who might be more talented than Gaskin. This is a guy who's going 46th overall right now in the expert consensus ranking. That's a scary, scary thought. You're taking this guy as your surefire RB2, maybe your RB1 if you go wide receiver or tight end heavy at the beginning. That, to me, is too expensive for a guy who I think next year isn't even going to be a startable running back for your fantasy football team.
Corey, it's a good call, and I totally agree with it. I think that Gaskin's a real risk this year for those guys that are buying into the idea that Myles Gaskin's going to be the same running back he was in 2020. I mean, you look at the fact they brought in Malcolm Brown, right? He's going to probably be the short area, goal line, potentially even pass catching guy. They still have Ahmed on the roster as well. And then they've also, I think the moves that they tried to make leading up into this sort of offseason has been telling, right? You look at the fact that they apparently were getting ready to draft Javonte Williams, and then the Broncos leapfrogged them to take him. And then they also tried to claim Kerryon Johnson before Kerryon Johnson was claimed by the Eagles. I don't know necessarily that the Miami Dolphins are done adding somebody to that backfield. They could be adding a guy like Le'Veon Bell or Todd Gurley or, I don't know, Duke Johnson or someone in the next few weeks. And that could put a big damper on the potential for Myles Gaskin to return that RB2 value, which is where he's currently being drafted.
Yeah, this has regret written all over it for me, Justin. Well, we've made it. We are at our number one bust. Justin, why don't you do the honors? Your number one bust for the 2021 fantasy football season.
Corey, speaking of regret, I hope I don't regret this call, because my number one bust for the 2021 season is going to be Minnesota Vikings wide receiver Adam Thielen.
Wow.
I know this is not going to be a popular take, Corey, for a lot of folks, because there's a lot of people that have bought into the idea that Adam Thielen is a great wide receiver in the NFL, and I totally get it. I mean, I think he is a talented wide receiver. And that Minnesota offense last year was a lot of fun to have a piece of, right? I mean, you look at their skill players, right? I was looking at it today as we were getting ready, and, you look at Dalvin Cook, who was the number one running back. You look at their wide receiver room. They had Justin Jefferson and Adam Thielen, who both finished inside the top 10 in terms of wide receiver ranks for fantasy finish last year. It was a really good offense to have some stock in, and all the key skill position players really performed really well. And owning Adam Thielen last year was pretty satisfying. I mean, he had 14 touchdowns. That's pretty ridiculous. Now, the end of the season, though, for Adam Thielen was not nearly as satisfying as the beginning part of the season for Adam Thielen. Now, I'm going to throw a couple stats out there at you, Corey, and I think these are telling, right? I think these are telling as we look into this coming season. Now, from week 13 on last year, Adam Thielen only averaged 6 targets a game after he averaged 8 targets a game to start the year. And then during those last 5 weeks of the season, right, from 13 on, he finished with fewer than 57 receiving yards in 3 of those 5 games. And he really relied on touchdowns to buoy that fantasy value for his managers week in and week out through the end of the season. Now, on the other hand, you look at his running mate, Justin Jefferson, the rookie phenom from last year. He saw in those last 5 games 10-plus targets a game, and he had 3 of those 5 games with over 100 yards per game receiving. Is that a sign that this offense will operate this way this coming season, Corey? I think it's pretty telling that the offense is shifting towards Justin Jefferson being their number one wide receiver, and I think Adam Thielen might take a bit of a step back. The other thing that's interesting, now we know that touchdowns are not a sticky stat, right? We know that when we look at fantasy football and we look at football in general, that touchdowns are not predictable year in and year out, right? You're going to have those players that go bonkers with touchdowns one year and then regress back to their career average, the next year. And I see Thielen this year, he had 14 this past year. I see Thielen more in that 7 touchdown range, right? So cut those touchdowns in half for this season, which is more in line with his career average, right? It's not a crazy take to think that Adam Thielen will have half the amount of touchdowns this year that he had last year. Now, that's all the offense, right? I think the defense for the Vikings as well is going to be pretty good this season. It's going to be better than last year. I mean, last year it was pretty horrendous, which led to a lot of pass-happy sort of catch-up situations at the end of the game. I think the improved defense this year will lead to more clock killing, right, running opportunities and probably less passing opportunities. And I just think, Corey, there's other wide receivers that I like around Thielen that I'll take above him. Guys like Guys like Cooper Kupp, I like him a lot. Guys like Deontay Johnson, I like him a lot. I even like, and I know this is probably a bold take, but I even like Courtland Sutton a bit more over Adam Thielen this year. Now, Corey, I know it's a risky take, right? It's probably not a popular take, but I'm going to say that Thielen's going to be a bust here in 2021.
All right, Justin. Well, let me try and take your risky take and try to beat you on it there, because I'm going to go with a guy who I was down on last year, and I'm going to double down this time around because he just didn't get out of the area of fantasy players and fantasy managers love. And that's a guy who people just continue to just be okay getting hurt by. And I guess I just don't understand it. And that's Mr. Austin Ekeler, the running back for the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, I understand the love. I understand because when he's on the field, there can be some really intriguing and exciting games. But if you watch those games with Austin Ekeler, sometimes and oftentimes it'll just come on these one big play where he's able to get a nice screen and get out in the open. And he does have some nice ability there. But this Los Angeles team seems to me like they want to find a ground and pound guy. They tried to find it in Kelly last year, and for a while, it looked like Kelly might have supplanted Ekeler before he started to lose the wheels off of what was going to be a good start to his rookie year. Now, maybe they'll try it with Kelly again this year, or they'll find someone else on that roster to fill that role, but Ekeler cannot be the in-between the tackles guys, which means that the fact that he's going as the RB10 right now is a really, really big deal to me. If you're going with Austin Ekeler as a top 10 second-round running back, that to me means you think he's going to be your anchor, your running back that you can count on to deliver week in and week out. And I just can't trust that in a guy who, A, gets injured quite often, and B, seems to have a team that doesn't want him to be the full workhorse guy. Austin Ekeler, to me, should be someone who falls much more down into like the late teens, RB19, even RB20. People still keep shoving him into their top 10. And Justin, to me, that is a risky move. You're going to hear me say it all year. Austin Ekeler is on the verge of becoming fantasy irrelevant, and that's why I think he's going to be a fantasy football bust this year.
Wow, bold take, Corey. I like the call, though. I think you and I both are far lower on Ekeler than the consensus these days, right? I think we both have him in that late teen area, and I think it's a good call, right? I mean, I just don't know that Austin Ekeler is that bell cow running back that you could potentially get where he's currently ranked, right? I mean, you look at guys like Joe Mixon, Cam Akers, Najee Harris, CEH. I mean, there are other running backs in that area where Eckler's being drafted that I would much rather have above him. I think it's a good call, Corey. I think he could still be pretty valuable as long as he's healthy in PPR leagues, but it's a bold call. I like it, Corey. I think you and I are both down on Ekeler this year.
Yeah, Justin, and that's the idea with busts. It's not guys that we think are going to be trash. As a matter of fact, a lot of the guys on my list today, I think are going to have fantasy value. But compared to where they're being drafted and ranked right now, I think that these guys are going to be red flags and grenades sitting on your team. And that's something you can't do because you can lose your fantasy football season in your first, second, third round of drafts. And that's when a lot of these guys might be flying off the board.
Corey, it feels so good to be talking about fantasy football again, man. We're slowly creeping our way towards the season. Can't come soon enough.
Yeah, Justin, I completely agree. And with that said, another week down, we've talked about our busts, and that'll do it for this week's episode. Justin, just want to remind our viewers that they can find us on YouTube, where they should like and download and comment and subscribe. And they can also find us wherever you can find podcasts. Please do whatever you can to show some support. I'm Corey.
And I'm Justin.
And this has been the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. We'll see you next time.
Royalty-free music courtesy of Ben Sound. The views and opinions expressed on today's episode are that of the Fourth and Long Fantasy Football Show. Remember to like and subscribe.